But being the chief of cost-effective climate change policy, I warned you that the descendants would debate about feed-in tariffs, but it really was interesting, and I found myself changing my mind about 3 times during the course of the debate. So, an interesting topic, couldn't be more topical, as we are, 16 days now from the Armageddon, is that the right word?
You're not doing very well.
It's been very difficult this morning, isn't it? Very difficult indeed. Anyway, 16 days from the dawn of the new age of prosperity, mother of love and apple pie. Will that do?
Much better.
Again, closer, very good indeed. Well, there we are. So, but I mean, really cheaper cost-effective climate change policy. Anyway, some interesting topics, and whether cheaper is the same as cost-effective is also an interesting topic we got into. I happened, oddly enough, that week to be doing something totally unrelated, which I thought was rather relevant and interesting, which was that the aid community had largely ignored the poorest people in the world, which was news to me. I thought that's what aid was all about, because it wasn't really cost-effective to get to them, or thought not to be. And the Millennium Development Goals really assisted towards that. I'm sorry, I'm rather talking about something people may not have come to hear about, but still, it makes a point. The Millennium Development Goals would set a target of, say, halving poverty by 2015 and other things. Because if you're going to hit that target, it's easier to get the people from just beneath above it than people far lower down below it. And so a lot of the aid community has been concentrating on people who are needy and deserving, but not necessarily the neediest people. And then some people are inspired by the huge success of things like the Caribbean Bank and some other things actually in Mexico and Brazil, where they actually give money to the very poorest people and find them enormously entrepreneurial. Actually found that though it was more expensive and harder to get to them, because they're right out in the countryside, of course they're very political crowds either, more expensive and harder to get to them. Actually, it was more cost effective to spend the extra money because of the lives saved and what you did. So it's an interesting debate between whether something is cheaper or more cost effective. Having rambled, there we are. So anyway, we have a wonderful load of speakers today, and we start with Mike Clarke, who was very recently taken over the chief executive of the RSPB, which used to be a sort of backwater job many years ago. I can remember it being so, but it actually had 2 very distinguished directors, and Barbara Young and Graham Wynne, who really taken it to its heights. I once was on the board of not a board, thank God, an advisory board to another environmental group, which remained nameless. And when the chief executive was named, we sort of said, what is your oh, for heaven's sake, let's say it. What is your ambition for the World Wildlife Fund, or WWF, whatever they called it at the time? And we expect to sort of change the world, or save the rhino, or something really worthwhile, to overtake the RSPB, he said. So there you are, there's altruism. So they never did, and Mike Clarke is now running it. He's an RSPB man through and through, he's been there 20 years, he still hasn't developed wings. Mike.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. Thank you. I have to say, I'm trying to read the significance into the minister being flanked by less and lean, but
well, me is very lean.
I'm sure there's a message in there for us somewhere. So, thank you very much. And just to kick off, in terms of referring to the government, we've certainly been very pleased to hear the Foreign Secretary's recent comments, his recent speech, and indeed see that complementing his coalition colleague Chris Huhne's recent statements too. So indeed, the government's affirmation of a commitment to 30% reduction in emissions by 2020 is indeed very welcome. And of course, all governments, let alone the greenest one, do need to recognise that there are no artificial deadlines in this. This is a real-world imperative. So the stance the government has taken is very welcome indeed. And as the Foreign Secretary said, domestic action needs to match international ambition. And that, in terms of action, government action will need to provide both security and prosperity, but also meet the needs of the environment and people. So we'll hear a moment from Simon, but we certainly see a lot of merit in the policy exchange arguments, but I have to say we don't agree with their conclusions. So of course, yes, a floor to the price of carbon is a necessary part of a strategy, but it's simply not sufficient to achieve the whole. And we see a strategy needs to go much further and wider broader than that, addressing factors not only that push, but also pull change. And in particular, we would want to see a retention in policy mechanisms but to make them more cost effective. So this means the support for renewables obligation, feed-in tariff, and I'll explain a little bit more in a moment about that. So, as William Hague has said, we need a strategy which really deals with, effectively, this is one of these things that's called a wicked problem. It's an interconnected set of challenges in a very networked world. And we need to look ahead to a plan and approach which is based on realism now in the 21st century. And there's three prongs to this strategy that we think is needed. The first is we are going to have to see a very rapid increase in the rate of transition to a low carbon economy. Effectively, you think about this in terms of the government, but by 2017, thereabouts, most of the steps that a government can initiate will have to have happened by 2020. Well, we're only a few months from 2011. This gives about a 7-year window in which a lot of the transition has to be made. And this means finding the most economically efficient ways of creating very rapid technological learning. And it'll have to include specific support, we believe, for technologies if we are to get that rapid development. So that's the first thing. There's got to be an approach which uses every approach to get that rapid transition. Second thing is we need to reshape our infrastructure. One of the things Nicholas Stern has pointed out, that one of the easiest, if you like, low-hanging fruit, cost-effective ways of doing that is actually the first thing, you'd be surprised if I didn't say this, to protect habitats that are actually rich carbon stocks. In this country, that means things like forestry, woodlands, it means the peat habitats of our uplands, and we should first of all just do easy things like stop the extraction of current peat for horticultural use and others. This could be done either by simply stopping it or putting a tax on peat. But this is a critical area and one that can easily be addressed, and particularly if we're moving to 30%, then land use emissions are going to become that much more significant in how we find those reductions. Second component of infrastructure would be to reduce some of the perverse incentives on bioenergy, which are just perpetuating the madness we've already had of biofuels. An example of this are the incentives that have now been introduced for biomass electricity by the last government. This is actually creating a boom in new electricity power plants close to deep water ports. This was intended to encourage the use of wood fuel. Seems like a very sensible thing to do. The way this has been introduced means that we are likely to see something like a subsidy of around about 1.2 billion by 2020, and that will mainly be importing upwards of 19 million tonnes of wood from overseas. And the problem with that is that wood will not be necessarily, in fact almost certainly will not be coming from renewable sources. It will be Eastern Europe, it will be Russia, be other sectors, and we need to see standards attached to that if we are to actually achieve the objectives of that policy, and indeed encourage more use of forests and woods in this country. So that's some of the practical things that can be done around infrastructure, looking at the natural assets. The third and final element of this strategy, and I think is in a sense the most fundamental and one we should be thinking about today, is actually how we change behaviour in society at every level. At the individual and neighbourhood level, there's a huge case for the feed-in tariff, because this is something which actually can engage communities and get buy-in for a low-carbon agenda. There's the business level. As I've said, there's an urgent need to shift investment into this low-carbon economy. It's already, in the Secretary of State's own calculations, worth 112 billion to this country and 1 million jobs in this sector. The UK has already become a world leader in offshore wind. We've got more projects installed, more are in planning, and more are in construction than anywhere else in the world. This is a major area that we're leading on. But we need to go further than this, and a very good example would be tidal power, particularly tidal turbines, as opposed to the rather 20th, even 19th century ideas of barrages. We've already seen this technology proven in Northern Ireland at Strangford Lough. We're about to see an array proposed for the Menai Straits between Wales and Anglesey. This is something that, alas, was not really listened to by the last government in terms of the Severn. We believe there is certainly scope for a lot more investment in that area, and one which again could create a new leading area for this country's economy. The point is that over the next decade, there's going to need to be massive further investment, 150 to 200 billion. This isn't going to happen just through single mechanisms. We're going to need all the tools of incentive, tax and regulation to leverage this investment. And then the final point is we need behaviour at government level to change as well. We need to see much more leadership in terms of the expansion of renewables. If I give you an example of that is wind generation. There's a real issue of public acceptability here, clearly. It's something my own organisation comes across. We clearly want to see a shift in the carbon generation in this country, in the energy generation in this country, and reducing carbon emissions. But of course, not all wind, onshore wind proposals and indeed offshore are acceptable. And so we will find at times we're objecting. Most often we're finding ways to find solutions. Well over 90% are very straightforward in our eyes. But nonetheless, we recognise our membership have a lot of disquiet over this, and it's something we've had to tackle. Now, the issue here is actually creating the right framework to enable much more effective and efficient decision making. Essentially, we've had a very simplistic agenda. Wind is good, and then it's left to the adversarial planning system to fight it out. And we have wasted, as many others have, huge amounts of time and effort in public inquiries just to find that the case is proven in favour of our concerns, and something hasn't gone ahead. The Lewis Wind Farm would be a very good example of that. We would really like to see, and we have trialled this with industries some while ago, a map-based approach, sensitivity mapping, a proactive engagement with local communities and civil society. We would like to see a map-based approach by government where essentially for both wind and other renewables, we're identifying those places where environmentally this is an appropriate location and those where it's not, based on sound evidence. So the final point I'd like to leave with you is the clock is ticking and it's time to act now. Most of that action is going to happen if we're to achieve 2020 while this government is on watch. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Well, I have a soft spot for tidal power because I'm told this is my one foray ever into policy making. I'm told by some of your esteemed colleagues that being in the Tory Party manifesto was down to something I wrote and persuaded people of. So anyway, of course, nothing is happening. So there you are. But some great softness for it. Now, Simon, I think Simon's the most unfortunate. I said it to him before. The most unfortunate CV, really. I mean. Start the director of Ofwat. I mean, for an anti-environment organisation that's done almost everything to obstruct it. That's pretty good going. Then to the Treasury. Well, I mean, need anything more be said? Then the DTI. Well, we all know about the DTI. I mean, it really is pretty depressing. I then read the next sentence, which I thought said he does independent counselling, so I thought, well, he does probably need it, but it actually says consulting. But actually, an extra line has been added to the bio since the Lib Dems, which explains it all. He went to the wrong university, I'm very sorry. PhD in science from Cambridge. Anyway, he has finally come good, and he's now head of the Environment Energy Unit, and policy has changed. Simon.
Thank you very much. Right, I'll go straight in. By 2020, the existing set of climate policies that we have in this country will be costing us over £16 billion per year through our energy bills. This is the finding of a recent policy exchange report, Green Bills. This is the equivalent of about 4p on the basic rate of income tax today, or about the same amount of money as we currently spend on policing and on the fire services combined. It's an effective tax through energy bills on households of about £250 per household, or about £700 per household if you include the pass-through of costs that go on business energy bills that will eventually make their way through to households. The 16 billion includes quite a long list of policies like the renewables obligation, feed-in tariffs, the proposed renewable heat incentive, etc. But it's still a significant underestimate of what the costs of existing climate policy will be, because it doesn't include, for example, the cost of the upgrade to the grid that will be needed to, for example, bring wind power down from Scotland to where people live in England. It doesn't include the conventional tax-based policies within the Department for Energy's departmental expenditure. It doesn't include the costs of regulations like the Large Combustion Plant Directive, nor does it include any costs of a reduction in competition in the energy market, which is likely to result from the set of policies. So, in conclusion, this climate change policy is becoming a very substantial cost to consumers and businesses. Now, if our minds were closed to the preponderance of climate science evidence, then the cost effectiveness of all this spending wouldn't matter to us. We just want to eliminate all these policies. But the climate science, though uncertain, says that there are some very grave risks to the planet from climate change. And anyone like me who takes these risks very seriously must also be very concerned about the cost effectiveness of climate policy and of the 16 billion plus by 2020. We should care about how much carbon we're going to save from each pound that we're spending. Now, unfortunately, the set of climate policies that the new government has inherited are far from cost effective across the board. They're not all uncost effective. There's a lot of poor policies in there, which means that resources are being wasted and less carbon will be reduced over time as a result of these policies. So I want to look at what would a cost-effective set of climate policies look like. Now, we first need to recall that climate change is a global phenomenon. A ton of carbon dioxide has the same effect wherever in the world it's emitted. And the UK accounts for only around 2% of global carbon dioxide emissions. China's emissions are growing each year at about the amount of total UK emissions. So UK policy must be aimed at maximising global carbon reduction effort. And there's two key domestic policy approaches to this, I think. The first one is having the UK or the EU taking a leadership role, reducing its own carbon dioxide levels in order to lead by example the rest of the world and encourage international action. And the second domestic policy approach is to use our resources to develop technologies and reduce the cost of those technologies, focusing on technologies which could have a significant impact on the problem of climate change across the world. So how does the existing set of UK climate policies measure up against these? Either or both of these approaches. So to take the first approach, leading by example, for this to be successful, the UK or the EU would need to be demonstrating success in reducing its own carbon levels, and at the same time, it should be doing so in ways which give a credible example for others to copy. Now, Policy Exchange report, which we're about to publish, will show that if you include all the emissions that the EU consumes, not just those that it produces in its own borders, that EU emissions have risen since 1990 at more than 40%. So demonstrating success in reducing carbon levels is questionable. But the main point I want to make today, relevant to the title, is that unnecessarily expensive ways to reduce carbon, low cost effectiveness policies for domestic carbon reduction, send a bad and unconvincing example to countries elsewhere. And we have plenty, unfortunately, of such low cost effectiveness policies. Now, the renewables obligation, which is the main policy for meeting the EU mandated renewables target, costs about £150 per tonne of carbon dioxide saved. The feed-in tariff for small-scale renewables costs much more. It costs an astonishing £460 per tonne of carbon dioxide saved. And you can compare these with the EU emissions trading system, which says that the marginal cost of carbon is about £12 per tonne. And the thing is that neither the renewables obligation nor the feed-in tariffs deliver any additional carbon reduction by 2020 over and above the cap set in the emissions trading system. So can these high-cost, low-cost effectiveness policies be justified under the second approach, the approach of bringing on technologies, bringing down the cost of those technologies? For success in this approach, we need policies to be designed to have the maximum impact on bringing down the cost of policies, learning by doing in those technologies. And secondly, you'd want those policies to be focused on those sets of technologies which had a chance of having a significant impact on climate mitigation across the world. Unfortunately, many of the existing policies are not designed in this way, but are really about meeting the EU renewables target in 2020, as well as focusing on other industrial policy and other political objectives. So, for example, subsidising micro wind turbines is not really supporting a technology that's likely to have a significant impact on global climate change. And rushing the mass deployment of a relatively early stage technology like offshore wind in the next 9 years is not the way to maximise the learning by doing impact of spending on a technology like offshore wind. So I fear that we're using up the public's and businesses' willingness to pay for climate mitigation without maximising the impact on climate mitigation, on reducing carbon. And in another recent report, we have tried to make some recommendations to improve the cost effectiveness and climate policy, and we're continuing to do positive work in this area. And I think some of the steps need to include definitely supporting improved energy efficiency in homes and in businesses. This is a cost-effective way of reducing carbon, and the government's Green Deal proposals are a very good step in this direction. Secondly, bolstering the carbon price, and we've said in our report, one way to do this is through a carbon tax. It's not the only way, but that's a really important step. We need to stop squandering resources on the most expensive, least cost-effective policies, and we've said that includes the feed-in tariffs and parts of the proposed renewable heat obligation. We need to review the EU renewables target. We need to see, can we renegotiate it, or can we meet it in a cheaper way? And we need to use the resources that we save here to put into policies which are designed to develop and reduce the costs of technologies that will be globally useful in bringing down carbon dioxide levels and mitigating climate change.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. I find that a very stimulating report. I mean, what we need to do is get the job done really over the next 5 years or so, and it's interesting. We'll come back later. We'll draw the discussion will be on that. Ben, I have a private theory that there are several of Ben Caldecotts. You do find them everywhere, and I think, you know, there's several doppelgangers around, and really, he's given the game away in the CV here. If you read his CV, he studied at 3 universities at once. This is my first charge. Read economics and specialised in China at London, Beijing and Cambridge universities. Well, that's point one. He then moved on to hold research directorship at the Policy Exchange, the Henry Jackson Society. That's 2 jobs going on at once. He's worked for a number of different government departments. It's building up, isn't it? International organisations. They have all sort of, and now he runs Climate Change Capital's internal in-house policy think tank, and also advises on CCCs, that's what we were and climate, etc., goes on forever. But he's a board member and trustee of the Green Alliance. So I think there are several of them around. Somebody denied this last time I did this introduction. And so there's only one of him. He's a free marketeer, but he's a nice guy. Ben.
Well, thank you very much, Geoffrey. That's a very kind introduction. So after Simon's talk, I think many of you who have fought long and hard for things like feed-in tariffs would have seen the fact that we're in room 101 slightly prophetic. But anyway, I'm very glad actually that this report was published. I actually had a bit of a hand in kicking it off, so I've partly my responsibility, I'm afraid. But one of the good reasons for having think tanks is that they provoke discussion and debate, and this report certainly does that, and I'd like to congratulate Simon for producing this bit of work. I want to spend the limited time available to me today to cover 2 things. I want to outline some of the things we could do to ensure the cost effectiveness of our environment and climate change policies. And secondly, I want to briefly touch on some of the other aspects of climate change policy that we really ought to think about a bit more and have been largely ignored. So I agree with the central thrust of the report. We do obviously need to deliver our low carbon transition in a way that is as cost effective as possible. We have a responsibility to do so, especially in the current fiscal environment. And obviously we need to ensure that taxpayers and consumers aren't paying more than they have to. And actually I think we can't base the future of our low carbon transition on stealth taxes. I think that's an unsustainable proposition. And it's right that we should be scrutinising this area in much more detail. And it hasn't had that for a very long time. So a few observations on how we might ensure cost effectiveness. The first is that we are moving from an OPEX world to a CAPEX one. So at the moment, the cost of plant infrastructure is very low relative to the overall cost of the energy generated. And we're moving to a situation where pretty much all renewable technologies are very CAPEX intensive and have very low marginal costs for operation. And the scale of that transition is immense. So Policy Exchange published a report when I had Simon's job that calculated roughly how much the low carbon transition in this country would cost over the next decade. It was about 250 billion. There are all sorts of other studies out there that suggest around the same number. In Europe, the number is 1 trillion euros. In America, it's about $1 trillion over the next 10 years. And you add all of this up, and it's a vast amount of money. And because it's a vast amount of money and it needs to be financed, we therefore need to think really carefully and long and hard about the cost of capital, because ultimately that is one of the two things that is crucial as we move to this CAPEX world in terms of ensuring cost effectiveness. The other, of course, is reducing the costs of the technologies themselves. And the other example, just to illustrate the point that you might have heard before, is that of course 1% of 100 is 1, and therefore if you reduce the average cost of capital on a £100 billion infrastructure programme, you can save £1 billion a year by reducing the average cost of capital, and that's something we should fight for. And that's why the discussions we're having about the Green Investment Bank, about how we can access the really deep pools of low-cost, low-risk capital from institutional investors, all of these things are really fundamental to ensuring we can deliver a cost-effective low-carbon transition. And that's another reason why electricity market reform that will happen after the comprehensive spending review is very important, because the policy framework behind our transition has an impact on the cost of capital. So we should be looking at things like fixed feed-in tariffs that can provide additional certainty to investors and reduce the cost of capital. That will make a massive difference, and I think that's very important. The other thing I think we need to consider is the fact that we need to remember what subsidies are there to achieve. They're there to achieve scale deployment. They're there to help drive down costs for new technologies. Technologies should not and cannot be dependent on subsidy forever. Subsidy is there to pump prime things. And funnily enough, government has never had a strategy for getting us out of subsidy, bizarrely. There is no exit strategy for renewable subsidies. And I think that's actually quite a dangerous position to be in. I think investors want certainty. They want clarity about what the criteria are for when subsidy might be withdrawn or when it will be sustained. And we just got to remember what subsidies are there for. And the third thing that will help us ensure cost effectiveness is the need to, as Simon put it, I mean, we've got to prioritise. There is clearly stuff, in my view, that shouldn't be a national priority for the UK, given where we are in the North Atlantic. So personally, I think it's a bit balmy that we're subsidising solar PV to the extent we are. However, and this is relevant for current policy debates, I don't think if there is a change, government should introduce a change to the tariff levels before April 2012, which is when it promised not to change these things for 2 years. And the reason it shouldn't do that is quite simple. It's retroactive. It would send completely the wrong signals to the market. It's kind of what the Spanish do. We shouldn't do this in Britain. So, we can have a debate about tariff levels forever, but the fundamental point is that if you've signed up to a tariff regime for a 2-year period, the government needs to stick by its word, otherwise investor confidence will disappear. So, despite saying all of this and broadly agreeing with the sentiment of Policy Exchange's report, we can't, climate change policy is multifaceted, it's complicated, it can't ever be based on one overriding priority the overriding priority of cost. We need to think about other things. And I think there are three other things we need to think about in addition to cost effectiveness. If we're going to create the support, the desire for collective action on something that's really very important. So in addition to cost effectiveness, I think we need to think about how we deliver all of this in a progressive way. As I said, most of this low carbon transition is funded as a stealth tax through our energy bills. That's a very regressive way of funding this stuff. And we all too often rely on stealth taxes that are regressive to do this, and that, we need to come up with a better way of doing it. The other two things that I briefly want to mention are opportunity and transparency. So we need to demonstrate that a low carbon transition is going to generate opportunities for our economy, for our communities, and for our citizens. For example, through green jobs, through new manufacturing sectors, reducing imports of fossil fuels, improving our balance of payments, improved energy security, better air quality, all these things that are much more tangible than ppms in the atmosphere. That's, we need to do that. And transparency, I think, is the final thing that has been ignored, but will come to dominate the agenda for frustrating reasons. I mentioned stealth taxes. We cannot keep hiding this forever, but also on the science. I mean, we need to be clear about what we know the risks to be and the nature of the challenge and the fact that it's about risk management and there are uncertainties. And all too frequently, this community, many of the people here, we've all been a bit too kind of blasé about the science, and that is clearly not the way to go. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I mentioned you were mentioning Spain, and old Spanish practice used to be the things that my industry, newspaper industry, by the trades unions, was the thing that almost brought us down. But I thought it was a little incautious to mention Spain. It has quite a significant influence in this government, on the Deputy Prime Minister in particular, but there we are. Now, Oliver, I always like cherry politicians. You know, they say that the very great journalist H.L. Mencken said the proper relationship between a journalist and a politician is of a dog to a lamppost. But having thought about it, lampposts are quite useful things. I mean, they can light the way and come the revolution and the reaction to the cuts. You can also hang people from them, whereas journalists, dogs, either sort of a watchdog or a lapdog, and I'm afraid there are far too many journalists in the second category. I trust I'm not, but others may have a different view. Anyway, as the last election, not this one we've just been through, but the one before that got underway, a guy who was one of the original skeptics, and I want to call him Merle Oberon, but he's not, he's Myron Ebel, rang me up and he said, it's all going to be over if the Conservatives win, because I've got this friend in the Tory party, and he's going to kill all this green stuff. And his name is Oliver Letwin. Well, I rang Margaret Letwin up first, and she almost wet herself in excitement. That's not fair, but she got very excited. But of course, the story never ran because it was balls. But it does show you how wrong the climate skeptics can be, which is probably a new thought to them. Because Oliver really has been one of the key influences in the greening of the Conservative Party and of this government. And his title is deceptively lowly. Minister of State in the Cabinet Office, we're responsible for government policy. I don't think I need to go into a very detailed explanation of how the government works. I just need to say that in 1997, the person who held that job was called Peter Mandelson. So no swearing in church, but it gives you some idea of his outreach across government. And also I met with him beforehand, as you know, Oliver, and we had a long conversation back in November, and was very impressed by the meticulousness that was going into how to get green policies united across Whitehall, the way prospective ministers, some of whom again didn't become ministers, but because of the coalition were working together to do that. One does slightly wonder if it's been blown off course by October the 20th and all the cuts. And I wrote the piece I wrote said, up yours, Sir Humphrey, but whether Sir Humphrey's getting his own back, and whether the cuts have taken over government policy and put all this preparation to flight. And the thing that makes me wonder about this is, you remember that very remarkable speech that the Prime Minister made at DEC in the first few days of the government? Quite extraordinary, I thought. Which, among other things, he said, I will be the fourth minister in this department. And then we hear how DEC is being slashed, and we even hear that DEC, I'm sure it's not going to happen, might be absorbed with the Treasury. And I gather the Perm-Sec actually warned his staff that might happen. So you begin to wonder who is running this government. But Oliver's going to tell us.
Well, thank you. Well, the first thing to say is I don't think I've heard a sillier idea in the last 10 years than the one you just mentioned.
No,
well, it isn't going to happen. If that's counted as a major announcement, then I've just made a major announcement. I'm sure that Chris Hume will be delighted to know that major announcements have been made. Let me begin back a bit, because the first point to make is that although the 20th of October and all the work that's leading up to it is fantastically important for the future of this country and fantastically difficult. One of the things that we have been most, I personally and those of us at the centre of government have been most keen to ensure is precisely that it does not interfere with our structural reform programme, whether that's to do with schools and hospitals or welfare or indeed our carbon agenda. And without giving away the slightest detail, I can tell you that I fully anticipate that the 20th of October will see the preservation of our carbon agenda and the ability to follow it through. It's part of the horizon shift that we're trying to achieve to make sure that coming out of a very, very difficult period, which results from the ghastly fiscal mess that we've inherited due to the irresponsibility of Mr. G. Brown, we do not compromise our long-term future, but on the contrary, look to the long-term future and build an economy based on the title of today's events at conference, green growth. And both the growth and the green bits of that agenda are equally important to us. And I think to our fellow citizens. Now that brings us to the question, which is the one that has begun to be debated here in a very interesting way, which is what is the right general framework for us to be implementing in order to promote green growth in this country. And rather than dwelling on much that I've agreed with over on my left here, the two participants left, I want to take on the argument which I don't agree with, which has been promoted on my right, because it's a really interesting and serious argument, and I think the nature of the disagreement that I have with it is worth exploring. I welcome, incidentally, the chance to have this discussion in the open, and I think we should go on debating these things. I don't think that these issues, which are incredibly important to the future of our country, can possibly just be forgotten about and pretended away. You have to open these debates out and take them on and argue them through. The essence of the policy exchange position is the starting point from which the rest, I think, is more or less implied. And it's the starting point that I want to debate. You were saying that we have a climate change agenda. Well, we do have a climate change agenda, but that is an international agenda. because, as you rightly observed, if we're going to protect our planet from what are, as I think you rightly put it, significant risks, there are no certainties in this field, but there are significant risks. If we're to protect the planet from those, that action has to be global in nature. Britain alone, even with the moral leadership, which I'll come back to in a moment, and I hope we will continue to show, is not going to change the world enough. And we're all conscious in this room of the extraordinary difficulties of finding a strategy for bringing the world together in a serious way, a seriously effective way to change the global climate change risk picture. But that is an international agenda, and it's not, I think, the essence of what we're debating today. Because what we have domestically is not simply a contribution to the global climate change agenda, though it is that, but it's a carbon reduction agenda. And in fact, I would put it even slightly differently from that. I would say it is an agenda to reduce the dependence of our economy on hydrocarbons. And that is a fundamentally different, though certainly related objective to the objective that you attributed to us. And of course, in a rational policy-making environment, and I'm delighted to say that so far the coalition government is a rational policy-making environment, a remarkable feeling to be part of a government which is a rational discussion. You drive the policies that you implement from the objectives that you seek. And if the objective is to reduce our dependence on hydrocarbons, then you are not just asking the question, how can we, in the short term, most cheaply achieve a certain set of effects? You're asking a different question, which is a long-term and not a short-term question. And it's about the whole structure of our energy economy. And once you start asking that question, first of all, you come to the conclusion, I think you're driven to the conclusion, that while considerations of capital and cost of capital that Ben was talking about are certainly significant, actually the big numbers, the really big numbers, have to do with the exposure of our economy, or the exposure to or protection from volatile costs of hydrocarbons and insecurities of supply, which may cash out mainly as price volatility, but may also ultimately have supply constraints built into them. You could get to the position where, if your economy is fundamentally dependent on the Maghreb, the Middle East and Russia, not exactly the country or areas of the world of choice to be dependent upon, you might find that you couldn't get the stuff at any price. And there's a very great danger of accountancy here. I'm not anti-accountant. I hasten to add, accountants are very fine things. You need accountants.
Sometimes.
Often, always. You always need accountants. like death and taxes, accountants are always needed. But there's a plaque in Chile on a statue And the statue is to the President of Chile who planted trees. And the plaque is a plaque of gratitude. And it's right, because generations of Chileans have benefited. But on an NPV analysis, he never would have done it. And while we're at it, nor would you have built Chartres or the pyramids, or actually anything else that makes human life worth living. Net present value is an extremely valuable tool for deciding about short-term investment decisions, which are single generational decisions, and where you're making preferences between different choices which you yourself will encounter the results of. In that context, discount rates and accountancy make perfectly good sense. But most of the most important decisions a society comes to make are intergenerational decisions. And these economic and accountancy tools wholly break down at that point. And you're forced back on much deeper considerations. And the economic disbenefits of very sharply volatile energy prices, and even more so, the economic disbenefits of energy security risks, are orders of magnitude greater than the quantities that the Policy Exchange Report is talking about. If you discount them away at 20, 30, 40-year horizons, you can forget about them. But 20, 30, 40 years from now, my children will still be here, even if I'm not, and it won't be much comfort to them to know that we did a lot of discounting. The consideration I think you get driven back to is in the end a consideration of intellectual modesty. We don't know. We just don't know what technologies will turn out to be the right technologies. And by the time we find out whether some punt we made turns out to be the right one, it'll be too late. So actually we have to pay attention to wisdom, which is deeper than these calculations. And Winston Churchill, who probably never heard of net present value, had a view about energy supply. And his view was, it's good to have it very diverse. And he was right. And what we need to do is to build an economy in which, first of all, we use energy vastly more efficiently. This can only be a gain if we are not so dependent on energy, and we get more output per energy, we will be less exposed to volatility and security of supply risks than if we use more energy, and we will reduce costs across the economy. That I think is almost the only certainty here. And now you come to the question, what is it that's going to provide the golden combination of reduced consumption, increased efficiency, a change in the distribution of energy in its load curve, so that we can have a modern system in which people respond to, households respond, businesses respond to shortages and increases of supply, and a diversity of sources of supply. And the answer to all of that is not just technological, it's also cultural. Through the creation at the center of all of this of a smart grid, through the rollout of smart meter technology, through the electrification of the car fleet, through the change of our relationship to waste and domestic gas production, through the feed-in tariffs and the proliferation of home-produced energy, through the Green Deal and through a carbon price support that opens the way to paves the way to a stability of expectation that gives us a diversity of sources of energy, combined with investment in CCS that allows us to move into a new low-carbon version of carbon-sourced energy. Through all of those means together, I believe we can shift the culture. I believe we can actually get to the point where we do have a system which responds, not just a sort of Stalinist system where we produce energy and people absorb it, but where there's a response mechanism. I believe we can get to a highly diverse set of sources of energy. I believe we can immensely reduce our dependence on hydrocarbons, and I believe we can be dimensionally more energy efficient. Now, if you look ahead without a sort of massive single generational perspective, and you ask yourself the question, how secure and how low cost and how competitive will our economy be 30 or 40 years from now if we do the things that I've just described, and do them energetically and synoptically, do the lot. Not penny wise, pound foolish, but invest now for a future which looks completely different and in which the culture is completely different. How good will the economy look then? Well, I'll tell you, it'll look one hell of a lot better than if we sit where we are and try and work out the last pence that we can save today. Taking one generation with the next, the gains hugely outweigh the losses. And that's the argument on which the government's programme is founded. It's an argument about a horizon shift that takes the next generations as much into account as the present generation and asks how can we found an economy that will provide prosperity and security hereafter. If you don't share that perspective, if you think the question is how can we do something which is most cost effective on a discounted basis today, you will not agree with our policies. Our policies are very consciously intergenerational policies. And that's a brave decision, but I think it's the right decision, and I think that's the debate we need to have.
Well, thank you very much, Oliver. I've chaired many of these meetings, but I think that's the most thoughtful and stimulating speech I've yet heard at a party fringe over very many years. Thanks very much. I do like intergenerational stuff, and if there was one change I could make to these blasted UN negotiations, I would demand that every negotiator would picture their children and grandchildren in front of them, and every half hour there was a break to look at them. It might change it. Okay, I'm sure the question will take them in threes. One there, one there, one there. I've been seeing three from those three people, I think.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Geoffrey. Charles Perry from Second Nature Partnership. And may I congratulate you, Oliver. I think even at 8 o'clock in the morning, you're beginning to sound like William Wilberforce. The reason I mention William Wilberforce is because obviously he took on a big challenge, which was humanity's dependence on another form of energy, human energy, in the form of slavery, and he managed to abolish that. And so I'd encourage you to go even a step further. I mean, you talk about dependence on hydrocarbons. How about actual addiction to fossil fuels, which other leaders, even notably George Bush, even mentioned himself. And certainly, my suggestion would be, and I'm interested in the panel's view on this, to actually set a date in the future, 2050 for example, by which time Britain will have weaned itself completely off our dependence on hydrocarbons, as some other countries are very vocally doing at the moment. And even chief executives of large multinationals are talking about reducing and eliminating those businesses' dependence on fossil fuels.
It's Martin Williams from Friends of the Earth. I think there is a lesson to learn from the Policy Exchange report, which is how important it is that we make sure those cost-effective things are all done. But I think we're learning the wrong lesson if we say that they all have to be done first before we move on to some of the more expensive policies. It sort of strikes me that if you went to the doctor after a car accident and they worked on the same basis, they'd give you aspirin because that was the cheapest thing to do, and then they'd see how that went on before they give you something more expensive like the surgery you needed. It seems to me to be the wrong way to go about it. So my question will be to Simon, which of the savings is it in those cost codes you have in your report that you don't think we need? Because if you don't think we need to make them, then it's fair enough to leave them off. But we are going to need, if we are going to need them, or as I believe we are, then we have to get on with it. My question to Oliver and the rest of the panel would be, do you think that the uncertainty that has already been created through rumours about feed-in tariffs being watered down through this sort of thing has already made achieving the targets more expensive and more difficult because of the confidence that's been lost in the industry already?
Just industry.
Dave Selden, Microphone Council. I mean, Ben was right, the policy exchange report certainly generated some debate. One thing that I found slightly depressing about it, apart from its criticism of feed-in tariffs, which you'd expect me to, was that the numbers that it was based on came out of the DEC regulatory impact assessment. And they were fundamentally incorrect because they counted all of the costs up to 20, but absolutely none of the carbon benefits that you get beyond 2020 from spending those costs. And so, you know, I'm sure you would end up with a similar conclusion in some respects, in that PV is going to be more expensive than energy efficiency. But I would at least hope that an organisation with a reputation like a policy exchange would scratch the surface of the government's numbers rather than just take them at face value, because they're incorrect. I think I very much echo the sentiments that Oliver put forward. Excellent speech about the multiplicity of policy objectives that we have in here. Because yes, policy exchange is right. If all you're trying to do is reduce carbon, and all you're trying to do is do that in the most cost-effective way first, then well, actually we can scrap the whole policy framework, spend 150 billion only on energy efficiency, but you'll be out of office if you try and do that. You'll put hundreds of thousands of people out of work if you do that, and you'll completely spook investors because they will lose faith in all of the policies that are in place now, that this government hopefully is about to introduce with things like the RHI, and so on. And I think one thing...
Can you bring this to a close?
Yeah, one thing we didn't hear, Simon, was it's fine to sort of say let's top slice some of the more expensive policies, but I didn't hear any concrete suggestions for alternatives. And in particular, if you start doing that, what would be the impact on investor confidence and cost of capital?
That sounds like a question. Simon, I think you're on the spot first. And
okay, thank you. Okay, Dave, I'll take the last question first. On the cost per tonne of carbon saved, we simply use the numbers to compare between policies. So there may be issues about how the numbers were come up with by DEC, but we were comparing a tonne of carbon saved by the EU ETS, say, versus a tonne of carbon saved by the FIPS, so they are comparable, and that's what we're using to do. I'm not arguing that energy efficiency is the only thing we should be doing. As I set out in my remarks, I basically use the next framework that we need to be doing. Subform behaviour change, that's around energy efficiency. We need to be also bringing forward technologies and getting the cost down, technologies that could be globally useful, and we need a carbon price framework. And it's in that last one, to respond to your sort of point about positive agenda, that's an area where the framework clearly falls down at the moment because there isn't a credible carbon price beyond 2020. Okay, the Friends of the Earth question, which of the policies don't we need? The issue here is that, first of all, it does matter what order you do these things in. You should be doing, you can't do absolutely everything at once, okay? In every area of government policy, everything will be done at once that you'd like to do. If you choose to do the cheaper things first and the more expensive things later, and this is how the Committee for Climate Change, for example, plan out how we might decarbonise the economy by 2050, that has a massive effect on how it affects the economy. So it is important that you pick off the cheaper things first. And another reason not to do everything bang at once is because there's an awful lot of learning that we need to do in the process of decarbonisation between now and 2050. And learning by doing takes time. There are cycles of trial, learning, changing. You can't just throw loads of money at something in 5 or 9 years and expect it all to work out. And then I want to come to the point about well, and here I'm going to take a moment, if I may, Chairman, to address the Minister's points.
Yeah, sure.
It's about,
Absolutely fair.
I mean, I think we agree on the direction that we want to go in, but I think the point that was made is what is the core objective driving the policy agenda in this area? Now, I understand very clearly the objective, which is about climate change and the threat of climate change. I mean, this is an externality. It's the biggest externality as an external that we've ever faced in the world, and it's therefore not something that markets can handle on their own. It needs a government policy agenda. It's clearly an intergenerational agenda as well, that takes some time talking about. It's a global one, but our domestic policy response needs to be in the context of the fact that it is a global problem. What I understand less is the objective around hydrocarbon volatility in the future as a driver. Now, rising hydrocarbon prices and volatile hydrocarbon prices are something which the market can, to a degree, address. If they see expensive hydrocarbon prices coming down the line, it's something they can address. Climate change, externality, markets aren't set up to, but they can on this. And let's take the gas market in the UK. Markets have addressed it. And the issue in the gas market in the UK is we're running out of North Sea gas over the next 10 or 20 years. So what's happened is the private sector, the market, has invested in enormous infrastructure development of import through liquid natural gas terminals. This means that we can now take out natural gas from all over the world. And because of the advent of shale gas, for example, we have seen some of the first movements of gas from North America towards Europe. So there's gas coming from the Middle East, North America, all around the world. We can take it all from anywhere, as well as the pipelines from Norway and continental Europe. So diversity of supply has been developed. That's dealt with the problems of volatility and problems in different parts of the world in gas. And the problem with the argument driven by hydrocarbon dependency and price volatility is that wouldn't it also lead us to open up the coal mines and start burning our domestic coal? Surely that is a policy response to the problem of volatile hydrocarbon prices and energy security. And why would we invest in carbon capture and storage? Because carbon capture and storage is a technology which requires us to import hydrocarbons. It doesn't seem to me that this is the key driver of the policy framework. The key driver is climate change. It's a global problem, and our policies need to do the most that they can to tackle that problem at a global level. And then my final point, regardless of whether of any difference of emphasis on what the core objective is, I think it's still important that if you want to reduce the use of fossil fuels, it's still important to look at the cost effectiveness of policy for doing that. And the feed-in, the feed-in tariffs is reducing our ability to reduce fossil fuels, because it is going to cost us £8 billion over the period of the programme that could be spent to reduce fossil fuel use, carbon emissions, to a much greater degree if it was otherwise spent.
Thank you very much, Sam. This is turning out to be a good debate. Now, if there are flaws in this policy exchange document, it is a cock-up between it really isn't Simon should be answering. It's Ben who designed the thing in the first place. So, Ben.
Well, I'm going to ignore that. Anyway, so the first thing I want to say is that I think Oliver's speech was absolutely superb, but it goes some way to addressing my concerns about the choice of the Tory party conference logo, which goes from green to blue, which is sort of a worrying trend, but clearly I shouldn't read too much into it. To Charles's point, right on, I completely agree with you. I think there's some massive contradictions and inconsistencies at a global and domestic level about our dependency on fossil fuels and extractive industries. I think fundamentally, once you find something and you invest in the infrastructure to start extracting oil or gas, there are a few, almost certainly it will be extracted and sold at any price. I mean, there are a few exceptions to to that, but that has massive implications for carbon lock-in, and we just have to look at, Brazil is investing heavily in offshore oil and gas resources. We're encouraging, Iraq, for example, to go down an extractive industry dependency route. That completely contradicts what we're trying to achieve internationally and at home, and we need to think long and hard about all that. On Martin's point, yeah, I completely agree that we clearly shouldn't start on the left-hand side of the McKinsey cost curve and then work our way to the right, for all sorts of obvious reasons. Related to that point is this kind of obsession with, set a carbon price and it will solve everything. Well, part of the problem at the moment is that if you did that, it would be actually incredibly inefficient. Technologies have different costs, and the reason we have differentiated levels of support is because they have different levels of costs. So if you just set a carbon price and let it rip, it would actually be a very inefficient way of doing it. And the point of a carbon price is that in the future, 10, 20 years from now, when we have a flourishing market and we have regulation in place, it provides, it's part of the market framework, and technologies can then compete fairly consistently with each other, and that's the objective in the end. With regards to uncertainty, I think that as long as we stick to there is clearly a lot of uncertainty because of the CSR and the electricity market reform that I mentioned. I think on FITs specifically, on micro FITs, if the government commits itself to sticking to its own promise of April 2012, we can go a long way to alleviating those market concerns. Just one final point. Actually, micro FITs are important, but relative to some of the other big changes that are likely to happen or be announced or be discussed and debated over the coming months, they're relatively minor. And I know a lot of people will not like me saying that, but one of the really important things is this transition for large-scale renewables from moving from the renewables obligation, which is a very inefficient and expensive way of subsidising renewables, large-scale renewables, to large-scale fixed feed-in tariffs, which I think that's a really important transition that will lower the cost of capital, and we're kind of ignoring it a bit because of the CSR and because of the micro-fit agenda, and we need to bring it back into focus.
I'm so sorry to cut you off, but Oliver has to go, so I'm going to put him on now to answer these various points and see anything else that he wants to say. I feel very guilty about this, having turned up late. I've deprived you of a few more minutes.
No problem. Thank you, and I do apologise for having to leave. I just realised I'm about to be late for another meeting. I think I need to answer Martin's point, and then I just want to come back to something that Simon said. I think that once October the 20th is out of the way and people see where we are, actually confidence will be restored. It isn't to say that there aren't some very difficult things that will be absorbed, but once they've been absorbed and people see that actually the strategy is intact, I think people will feel there's a future out there, because the whole point of October 20th was to, not just in this domain, but many, to take the pain now, get people clear, and then move on and provide a pattern for the country over the next 4 years, so people know that we're not just sort of doing things over and over again, you know where you are. And just to continue what very interesting and important discussion that comes out of what Simon was saying. First of all, incidentally, I agree about the carbon price. I mean, there's been a lot of agreement here. We need a long-term carbon price, of course we do. And that's what we're going to have. And without that, we won't get some of the biggest, chunkiest investments, which are part of the diversity argument. I mean, you cannot pave the way, for example, to nuclear power station replacement without a sustained carbon price. And I agree also that learning by doing takes time. My answer to your question about why we would want to have things that give incentives for very large numbers of people to participate in all this is yes, it does take time, and the shift of culture that we're trying to achieve actually involves engagement. And I think it's extremely difficult to put value on engagement, but I think it is in fact enormous. But your fundamental point was, why not just let the market address the volatility and security issues? You pacify the effects on the planet as an externality, but the long-term effects on the British economy as something the markets ought to be able to address. And I think that is really the fundamental divide between us. You have to ask, why is saving the planet an externality? Why don't markets price that in too? I mean, after all, if the planet becomes very unsustainable, that's kind of bad for business. And the answer is that markets don't do that because those of us who have tried to run businesses know that you can't ask the question, what will the people after me be doing with this business? You have to worry about the business now. And that isn't just literally, I'm not engaging in the naive, silly Neanderthal socialist attack that, all businessmen only ever think of 5 minutes. Of course they don't. Of course they think in terms of some years ahead and so on. But it's some years and not some generations. And that's why markets are not good at thinking about and coming to rational conclusions about things like the effect on the planet. The private return is measured over a shorter timescale than will allow you to think in those terms. Well, the same is true with energy security and energy volatility. And yes, you do get some short-term effects. It's perfectly true that with a bit of shoving and heaving, markets have invested in LNG. Would they have invested in what we are now investing in, which is very significantly more gas storage capacity, so that there's more security supply? I doubt it, actually, even then. And that's relatively short term. Do we need to open the way to the possibility, if it comes to that at some point, of using our coal mines on a non-carbon paying basis? Yes, that's one of the reasons for CCS. I'm not saying that tomorrow I expect to see huge amounts of UK coal being burnt in power stations that is not currently being used for that purpose. But one of the points about CCS, one of the many points about CCS, is that it can open the way to 300 years worth of coal supply should we find that we need it. And no market will deliver that. So the final question is, okay, you say, even if that's your objective, because you think there's a market failure here too, shouldn't you be doing it in the cheapest possible way? To which my answer is, I think really roughly Martin's answer, you have to do a bit of a lot of everything, because the scale of what we're trying to achieve is so great that unless we shift the culture in all sorts of respects simultaneously, we won't get the sort of, I don't know what the fancy economic term is, but the synergistic benefits of multiple activity. And what I really mean by that is, in the end, you are either living in a kind of culture where you assume that if you turn the lights on, or you drive your car, or you sit in an airplane, it doesn't matter, someone somewhere will provide some liquid that comes from somewhere that will power this, and that's kind of okay. Or you live in a different world where things have been restructured, and roughly speaking, you get up in the morning and the thing that's you're turning on is something that doesn't rely on dicky parts of the world to produce substance in short supply, nearly so much. And when you sit in your car, it's been plugged in overnight, and you get on a high-speed train instead of an airplane, and when you go downstairs and cook your boiled egg, actually the freezer's turned off for half an hour because it's responding to the price signals from the grid, and your phone is showing you what the smart meter's doing, and you're very interested by the fact that you've started making some money this morning because there was a shortage in the grid, and you're living in a kind of different universe. And that shift of mindset just doesn't come about by just having a tool called the carbon price, important though that is. It comes about by doing a whole series of things all at once to change the nature of our society's relationship to energy. And that, in the end, you can't get off the cost curve. Anyway,
I'll put mine back on, but thank you very, very much for giving us your time.
I'm sorry to disappear.
It's been a long time. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, I mean, if I could just say, as representing a membership-based environmental organisation, I think I'm agreeing entirely with Oliver. This is actually about leadership and change. And we have to address the cultural issues and public engagement here as much as anything else. To get the framework, I mean, just to go back to the point, we need a framework that, in terms of some of the questions, we need a framework that achieves the environmental targets in the time. This is a time-bound objective that has the investment in infrastructure that is which is carrying public support. So yes, we need to give consistent signals on things like feed-in tariffs. Yes, we need to create a sense of achievability that even 80% reduction in fossil fuel usage by 2050 can be done, and that is maintaining public investor confidence. And I mean, I think this is a question of, frankly, looking at this in really quite a pragmatic way, but recognising that societal change and attitudinal change that's needed in behaviour. And I think it's just a question that, in a sense, theoretically, an algorithm on price is not enough. We have to be addressing these other routes if we are to generate this change in attitude.
Thank you, mate. Well, we're now more or less at the witching hour. We could, is how it's around? We could, I think, take another 3 questions for the panel if people wanted to give them. I know the star attraction is gone. Does the panel agree, or do you want to, you've got to go? Everyone's going to go. I'm terribly sorry. Well, I feel guilty about this, but I think you'll agree with me. It's a very, very, very stimulating meeting indeed. I hadn't really realised we were actually in room 101. I don't know what that says for the Policy Exchange report, but all very fascinating. And as always in these things of economics, I don't understand things at all myself, but I want to remind you this wonderful story about which is the oldest profession in the world. I think you know what the oldest profession in the world is, but we'll leave that by for the time being. It was an argument between let me get this right, a surgeon, an ecologist, and an economist, which was the oldest profession. And they used the Bible. And the surgeon said, it's very clear, there's very early on in the Bible, you've got God taking the rib of Adam and making Eve. The surgeon was clearly oldest profession mentioned. No less than the economist. Go back to the first few verses there, you've got God creating heaven and earth in 8 days. The economists go first. No, said the economist. Think beyond that, think behind that. Before all that happened, there was chaos. Thanks very much.